Enjoy a seat at the table and good company, where great conversations and meaningful discussions happen.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sarah Beetleholtz. We all know a great dinner party isn't really about the food. It's about the people seated around the table engaging in lively discussions. And Good Company gives you an opportunity to enjoy a seat at the table to watch great conversation as it happens. I am pleased to be in the company of Ahmed Abdelmageed, who is the host of the I, an Immigrant podcast, and actually is soon going to be leaving Fort Wayne to pursue your next step of your professional career in the area of pharmacy education, correct?
Yeah.
So your background, you have a doctorate, right?
Doctor of Pharmacy, yeah.
So you really are a pharmacist and then an educator in the field of pharmacology, correct?
In pharmacy in general, yeah.
Yeah.
I've been in academia for about 12 years.
But what I really want to talk to you, although we could really talk about how that's changed, maybe we'll get there, but I really want to talk about also the idea of the I, an Immigrant podcast, because what's airing now is the second season.
That will be released soon, actually.
Oh, okay.
What's airing right now is season 1.
Okay, so, and then they'll be running the second season, but you probably won't be here.
We've actually finished recording season 2. We're in the last stages of editing, and hopefully this summer it will be out.
So what I want to start with is a little bit is why you decided to do the podcast and sort of what as you reflect back of just finishing the second season, sort of what have you learned and what's different from the people that you've had on?
So the prompt really for creating the podcast, it started a few years earlier. A lot of my involvement in the community, whether interfaith activities or speaking my experiences as an immigrant or what have you, have been to humanize the label. And unfortunately over the past few years, and in particular, honestly, in the year or two leading up to our last election with Trump as president, the conversation took in my opinion, a completely wrong direction. And the immigrant has been painted in a very negative light.
Right.
So it kind of materialized that idea of the I in immigrant, or the I behind the immigrant. And it started with a TEDx Fort Wayne talk about 3 years ago. And then it materialized more and more in similar to what you're trying to do with And Good Company, which is having conversations with people and getting to know them. So when the shift in societal conversations around immigrants has shifted to what it's been over the past few years, I decided that people don't really know who is behind that label. And so I decided to interview really friends that I knew. I knew they had great stories. And from there, I asked friends to suggest some other friends. And that's where season 2 is going. We branched out of Northeast Indiana into different states and branched out a little more into actually family dynamics. Wife of an immigrant, husband of an immigrant,
right.
child of
or
an
your
immigrant.
parents being, like your children being born in America, they may not identify with, right, and that's a big
So
sort of issue.
All the intersectionalities of identity that come with being an immigrant or new to the United States or born to immigrant parents,
Right.
and giving people a glimpse into the humanity behind it, that they're hardworking people, that they've come here for a better life. They're usually, majority are very engaged and involved in their community and for the betterment of their community.
And they're concerned about their children and the betterment of their children's lives and a better, safe environment for them, and that there's more more we have in common than we're different in a sense.
Absolutely, and we don't realize that, and we will never realize that unless we have conversations and get to know each other on that level.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, so let's. I want to say that how you identify yourself. So you're a Canadian citizen, right? And you're a Muslim, correct? And then, but you were born in Qatar, correct? But as you were explaining, in Qatar, you can't be a citizen it's not, you're not born into it. You're not naturalized as a citizen. And then you also you also describe yourself as a Palestinian. However, you've never lived in Palestine. Your parents left there when they were both very young, right, under the age of 10.
Yeah.
So how, and your faith is not beholden to a place, right?
No.
Being a Muslim, and there's partly that confusion about all the Muslims and the issue of, especially when you talk about how we perceived immigrants and after September 11th, which you talked about in your TED Talk. So explain to me, when you look at this continuum of how do you define what an immigrant is or somebody, I want to sort of understand where this role of being a Palestinian, because typically that would be someone who's from Palestine, how you identify yourself there and why that is so important to you.
So one of the things is with immigrants in general, there's a complexity of identities. It's not just a one thing. And the complexity for me personally is, my parents were forced out of their homes with the establishment of the State of Israel at the age of 8 and 5. And so they lived in Palestine and lived in refugee camps near the Egyptian border. But then they were in pursuit of a better life. They couldn't live under occupation, couldn't live in the economic and everything else that was going on. So my father moved to Qatar. So he moved there on a work visa, and you're sponsored by a citizen, and you will remain under the sponsorship of a citizen until either your employment is done and you find another employer, or your employment is done and you have to find another place. Well, we had refugee travel documents issued by Egypt, so we didn't really have a country to call home, and we couldn't get naturalized in Qatar. And so for me, I grew up, even the country that I was born and raised in, which is Qatar, I grew up still with the sense that I'm a second-class citizen.
Although you did grow up in a very much a Arab world environment, and you spoke Arabic.
It's an Arab country, predominantly
So
Muslim.
it was, that was more familiar to your upbringing than.
So to my parents, the having a Muslim and Arab country was important, but at the same time, we couldn't own a house, we couldn't own a business, and you had to work everything through a sponsor.
But that was really the nature of the rule. Is that because of the rules or requirements of Qatar?
Yes, a lot of the Arab countries have that there's really a very limited and very hard path to naturalization. Qatar did not have that. So growing up as a refugee or a second-class citizen, I had that sense of I can't call the country in which I was born home.
Right.
And because of the issues and the current situation and everything about Palestine, it was embedded in us that we'll always be Palestinians because that's part and parcel of our identity. So you grew up as a refugee in a country that
so
you
that
can't
was
call
part
home.
of your, was that part of your cultural heritage, or was that part of your family history? Because I mean, the sense of you would say that now you're a Canadian citizen, right? So technically you would say you're Canadian. I mean,
But one does not erase or conflict with the other. I'm multiple of things, and each place in which I've lived, or each place in which the culture plays a big part of who I am, is still dear and near to my heart, and I identify with. So I like to liken myself or the immigrant experience in general in the United States as a mosaic. You're made up of different pieces.
Right.
Each beautiful on its own, but when you look at the big picture, it makes it an even better, bigger picture. So the Palestinian part is part of who I am, part of my culture, because you're identified as Palestinian in Qatar. So the whole, and then our parents always identified as Palestinian.
But here, you wouldn't be.
Here, I'm an American citizen. I'm an American citizen. I also have a Canadian
and your
citizenship.
religion is that you're Muslim, but they wouldn't say that you're, they may say your background is Arabic, but they wouldn't necessarily define
They
it.
wouldn't define it. They wouldn't even actually, when you look at the U.S. Census, I fall under the white category.
Right.
So it's...
Oh, you're not an other?
Nope, I'm not an other.
Because you're not, because just like, because Muslim is a religion, it's not, it's not an ethnicity.
So the religion has nothing to do with the ethnic or race categorization in, so that's more of the religious belief, which category do you fall into, which, you mentioned September 11. We notice actually post-September 11, a lot of Muslims wouldn't identify as Muslims in fear of retribution or retaliation.
Because because again of not getting to know the people, everybody put them into one bucket. Right?
Yeah, but when you look at on the U.S. Census and you fill out the page, the area that they define as the Middle East falls within the white category as well. So it's not nuanced enough for people to Arab in itself is multi-ethnic, multi-religious. There's a lot of Christians. There are Arab Jews as well. There are Arab Muslims.
Right.
And so that's kind of.
So is it more of a culture, because what I'm trying to understand is when you say that you identify as a Palestinian, are there certain cultural practices? Is there certain, because I know that a lot of how you live is dictated also by your religion. So I'm, as being a Muslim, but I'm trying to understand why that identity is important and what that brings to who you are. And then within the immigrant experience. But just because I looked it up, because I was trying to think, because you wouldn't say, people are defined, where they live or where they're from, and so because when you say a Palestinian, it's someone who's from Palestine. So, but it didn't predict, certain.
I see, because I wasn't born there. I guess.
Well, I mean, you didn't live there. Yeah. I mean, so I'm just wondering is it more the.
It's the because of the being displaced in if we call it the Palestinian diaspora.
Right.
We hold on to the culture a lot more. So there's either the dialect in which I speak in Arabic is a Palestinian dialect.
Okay.
The food that we make at home is Palestinian dishes. A lot of the cultural heritage is informed by the generations of my predecessors who've lived in Palestine, my parents as well. And their parents and grandparents and so on and so forth. So it plays a big part of my cultural identity, but also the continual struggle that we're in.
Right.
It informs my political identity and how I speak about the situation.
Right.
The religion itself, as a Muslim, it's not anchored to one part of the world or the other. You can live wherever as a Muslim. And it's a guide, it's a compass for you spiritually, it's a compass for me in how I treat people and how I look at improving myself as a person and so on and so forth. And so if a cultural issue clashes with a religious principle, the religious principle takes precedence over that, if that's the question.
Which would be difficult in some ways raising your children in America, because you don't have that, like in Qatar, you were all in that environment, so there were certain things you couldn't do or how you...
It's a challenge, for sure, but actually even in Qatar, one of the talks that I've, or the trainings that I've prepared and I've been doing over the past few years is Islam and Caring for the Muslim Patient. And in that talk, I talk about being born and raised in a Muslim country has not really informed me much about the religion. It was when I left and I came here where people from all walks of life and people that don't even believe in the concept of God made me question, why do I call myself a Muslim and why do I practice my religion? And so I kind of had to relearn. So being born and raised in a Muslim majority country, you get almost a little complacent. You're just following what everybody else is doing. So what I'm trying to do with my children here is, surround them by Muslim families, but at the same time, see the reality in which, and how can they be a good Muslim, regardless of where they are, whether in a Muslim predominant country or a non-religious country like the United States.
So I think, I think it is appropriate that because both of us are really looking at the opportunity to have these conversations, and you also talked about in your TED Talk or maybe it was the Creative Mornings where you said, how do you ask the questions so they're not offensive, and how do you answer so they're not defensive? Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I think would be an opportunity, and just how you said it's really knowing people, is the fact that you are Palestinian and that I am Jewish, and now I would never I'm not Israeli, but the idea of us both sitting, and how we view what's happening and the conflict. And so I think it's a perfect example, and really want to use this opportunity to show how when you have two people who are people and not looking at this as governments and issues, how you really can have a conversation and sort of get an understanding. And so why I was really thinking about why you define yourself as a Palestinian and why that's important to you when I was thinking about this conversation, and why I really wanted to understand that is because of the fact that you feel so strongly in your view about and we talked about this, like you will not describe it as Israel, you'll say it's Palestine, and why that was so important to you, because I wanted to understand that within the context also of your being an immigrant, but also the support that you provide and that you're very steadfast in it. So I think that in all...
And that's, I mean, halfway there is just having the conversation. And I have a lot of Jewish friends that, we talk about these issues and other issues,
Right.
but, politics and political conflict and how things are presented and how things are not presented are always areas of tension and always areas in which I can simply, and we see it in our American politics now, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, and if you fall in this camp, you're this and you're that. And it's easy to label someone with something. It's easy for the mind to just say,
It's
she's
black or
this,
white, right.
he's that,
Right.
and I'm done. They're
Right.
exactly this way. There's a lot of nuance that I feel sad for people that miss out on the amount of nuance that they miss out on by just saying, oh, she's Jewish, I'm not talking to her.
Right.
Or, oh, he's Muslim. Or
Well,
he's
that's the
Palestinian.
same about being an immigrant. I mean, when you see someone who's different than you, or learning from them, or wanting to experience it, and not just being in your own sort of like kind, and getting out beyond that. But I do think also, I would say that probably in a very long time, you were the first Palestinian person that I really have even engaged with to talk, especially in light of the most recent situation, that I've really talked to, and probably, have really thought about it in that way. And so I remember, because I was interviewing you for a separate thing, and at first I sort of was I felt like, you did say, like, I'm not sure where this is going, and I felt like we were both a little defensive, because I think we were caught off track. I mean, it just...
It was like
I
a completely different
expect
topic, and that
right.
came
Well,
up.
because when you mentioned Palestine, and then I said, oh, Israel, and then it just took me. But then I took a step back, and I really thought about it, and I was like, here, this is an example. This is the type of conversation that you want to have, and to really understand from your perspective and what the issues are, and sort of... And that's why I was so interested in why you have to identify so much of it. And I can understand that, because there are always times, are you an American Jew, or are you a Jew who's American? And then would you ultimately, as an American or Jew American, would you always stand by Israel or not? Which is what is happening with a lot of... It's a big problem now with American Jews, this issue of do they stand or not. So I thought it was, so I just thought that really sort of was interesting to me, and I wanted to understand that, and then also to really understand how, why that's so important to you. But being able to have these conversations, I think, was so interesting, because at first I was like, oh, this very hard line, going to be extremist about this. And then I did, and in all truth, I went back after we met a couple weeks ago, and then I really did. I looked at, because I really, thought, well, okay, do I really understand? I knew from the, from the formation state of Israel and everything, and I looked at it and I said, well, do I really understand all the nuances? And so then I really looked at it, and then I began to understand, like, the Nakba and how certain things happened, but in some ways, was it really a situation that was really fair for the Israelis to be put in, because they didn't really get, nobody really thought about when they said, okay, we're going to give them, this land. They didn't think about, well, what do we do with the people who live there? And, and sort of, so in all fairness, I was like...
But that's the beauty of having a conversation.
Right.
It planted a seed, and, in fairness, 20-some years ago, 26 years ago, when I moved to the United States, I didn't have Jewish friends. I didn't know much of, and I want to make a clear distinction between Israel and Judaism as well. It's not, one is not the other, and the other is not one.
It's the same thing like Muslims and Palestinians.
Exactly.
One is a religion, and Israel, even it's not even, I wouldn't say it's my heritage. I mean.
So, but, when you grow up with one particular thought, I'm like, oh, they're Jewish. I don't know how I can talk to them. I don't know how to approach them. And then you realize that in those conversations, it planted a lot of seeds in me to learn about Judaism and Prophet Moses and how we revere him and respect him in Islam, and to talk about, the Jewish heritage and the Holocaust and everything that's
and it all goes back though to the same thing, that in the end of the day, so much of it is it's a conversation, but it's also people, and realizing that they want the same things, and and just like you felt that you weren't, that you weren't home in like Qatar, or that you didn't have a home and you were displaced. Well, I mean, you can imagine also what the feeling was when, after the Holocaust, and people, nobody wanted the Jews. I mean, it wasn't like...
And that's the thing, is that, are we headed to something like that? God forbid that we don't go towards something as major as the Holocaust. But when we shut each other down and we don't talk about our differences and don't realize that the differences actually complement each other more than they are opposing differences, that's when we end up in situations like, let's talk about our home here in the United States with what happened in Insurrection Day. And we've gone to those extremes that just completely blew my mind. And to circle back to the concept of hyphenated American that you talked about, it depends on how it's being used. Because for me to say I'm Muslim American, or I'm Palestinian American, or Arab, whatever, I'm highlighting a big part of my identity, and I'm celebrating the fact that I can highlight that and celebrate it here, as opposed to someone who's saying, well, you're not American enough, you're African American, or you're Asian American, or you're Arab American. So that.
But the irony also of it is like you said, that before you came to the United States, you really didn't necessarily challenge or think about your religion or why you were practicing. I mean, you're sort of. So the irony also is that the United States also gives us all, because technically we're all immigrants here.
Exactly.
So I mean, and we all
except for the natives of this land, we're all immigrants here.
So, but the idea that it gave you the place and the luxury to be able to do that.
To challenge my comfort place, to challenge my thought process.
And do you think that that's partly why there's such a hesitant with understanding people who are different or from different places, is out of your comfort zone, or are you afraid that you may, like you said, how do you ask a question so that it's not offensive?
How do you ask without offense?
But if you know that your intent, it's like, I always think kids are the best. They're gonna say like why do you wear glasses? And they don't mean it in making fun of you. They just are gonna ask the question.
They're curious.
So if we know that we're coming from that place of we're not of goodness and we're trying to understanding, then maybe we wouldn't be afraid to.
And that's why I didn't put the onus on one party or the other. I didn't put the onus on the questioner or the one who would answer that question, because it's a two-way. Any conversation is two-way. Now, I think we've gotten to a situation again where it's so tense and so heightened that if you ask me, and I'm not comfortable with it, or I've just read the news about an attack on an Asian woman in New York, and I'm Asian, and you're asking me about, hey, where are you from, or whatever, it heightened a lot of the emotions. And so what I was hoping with this podcast, and why I agreed to join you in this recording, is that we have to get past that little bit of discomfort and just have a conversation. But the thing is, a lot of times, even very well-intended people, and I talk to them about that, they dance around the question they want to ask, or they ask it in a way that I don't want to offend them. I want to be politically correct about it. Hey, forget about that. Let's just once we've gotten comfortable with each other enough, let's have that conversation. Let's ask these questions. I would understand that it's coming out of a sense of curiosity and a sense of wanting to know. But also, that doesn't mean that the first question you ask me when you notice my accent is, well, where are you? Unfortunately, again, because we've come to the situation that we're in. And no one is obligated to give you the answer, too. I mean, there's a sense of entitlement sometimes in some conversations. So for people who are in those situations, it's kind of not teaching necessarily, but just relearning how to navigate this conversation. I know I'm a token. I'll put it this way. I know I'm a token in many different ways, but I know when I'm being tokenized, and I know when I'm actually part of an important conversation. But I've learned that over 26 years living in Canada for 4, and then the rest here, and I've learned how to navigate those conversations, and I'm blessed in many different ways in being able to have these conversations. But not everyone is as comfortable, or not everyone is able to articulate it as others, and that's where I think a lot more of the tension. Add on top of it whatever news or whatever spin or whatever you hear, and it completely muddies the water, and it builds a wall. And if you're not going to cross that bridge or try chip away at that wall, we're going to live in our silos and echo chambers, and
the divide's just going to get bigger and bigger, and it's just going to become more polarized. And yeah, I mean, so it's so how do you think, because the first season, most of the people you spoke to were from Fort Wayne, Northeast Indiana. So, and from your own personal experience of being in Fort Wayne, and you are leaving because you're going to go run the pharmacy program at St. Joseph College?
University. Yeah.
Okay. So on hindsight also, looking at it, but how do you think we're doing? Like, because, we have the Fort Wayne, United, and everybody's talking about diversity and inclusivity, and so from your perspective and really from having these conversations, how do you think we're doing on it? I mean, do you think that we are welcoming? Do you think that we're trying to understand, or do you think it's sort of something we should be? I don't know. I'm just curious of what you think.
And I want to be also a little more nuanced in answering that question, because I'm not a black person, so I cannot speak to the experience of a black person in Fort Wayne. So that part of diversity.
I'm talking about, but we're limiting it to your scope and your experience, but also with the immigrants. And I think
Muslim.
Also we do have to take a pause a second, because I was thinking about this. There's some, I think, confusion, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, between the idea of an immigrant and a minority. Like, I don't think that we necessarily, not all minorities are immigrants, and not all immigrants are minorities, because just like you pointed out, most people would think, well, he's Muslim. Well, you said you'd be in the classification of race as white, and I never really thought about that before, but yeah, of course. So, but I think that there's that blending or confusion of those two.
Yeah, and there's minority and there's minoritized. I actually like to use the verb more. But back to the, I guess,
so within that nuance.
Within that
right,
nuance,
okay.
yeah. So the experience as an immigrant, Fort Wayne has been very welcoming, and you can tell that from the history of welcoming Bosnians during the Bosnia-Serb war. And now with the Burmese over the past few years, it's welcoming in the sense of open doors to immigrants to come and settle and be contributing members of
or to give them
society.
safe haven if they're from persecution.
And I have to give props and kudos to the Burmese community here. They've done amazing work in the southeast side. They've opened businesses. They have a generation that's being raised here or born here.
They're actually their home ownership is 3 times higher and faster than the African American community. But I also believe that's partly because in some ways they do isolate themselves in some ways, and it's a very sort of protected and community.
Which we see with a lot of new immigrant communities in which they want to kind of, again, that balance, that battle, whatever you want to call it, between holding on to what you know and getting to know
and being assimilated, and that I think is partly the problem with why the decline in American Judaism is because of the fact that we've done too good of a job of assimilating
So
it could be a blessing and a curse, but
finding that balance is difficult.
Right.
So it's welcoming in that sense. And one of the things that I work on from it's DIBE, diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, and I think of it as more of a spectrum. And I kind of created a diagram, trying to hopefully eventually come up with a scale with it. But if we talk about diversity in the sense of having people from different groups, I think Fort Wayne does a good job with that.
Okay.
Inclusion, we're starting to take a couple of steps towards that, but the belonging and equity, we're still in our very early stages to get towards that.
Right.
Part of it is just growth. It's going to take time. These things don't happen over time. I don't necessarily think that there's any, and again, from my experience, I don't think that there's systematic issues in Fort Wayne. I think it's just more of getting acclimated to the new normal, or to having more people that don't look like you around and seeing the positive that they bring to town. The Burmese community, because I'm familiar with them, they've built a lot of businesses. They're business owners, they're homeowners, like you mentioned. They're reviving a lot of the economy, I think, on the southeast side of town as well. So they've
Right.
done a lot of good for the community. So if, in that perspective, Fort Wayne is the longest I've lived ever since leaving Qatar, 10 years here. And if it hadn't been for the work situation, my wife and I were deciding on just this is home for however long we can live here. And I say that because of a lot of churches welcomed me in to talk about Islam, and it was out of curiosity about the religion. A lot of people that I've met that want to learn more and want to learn better how to integrate, how to communicate. I've done the most interfaith and immigrant work in Fort Wayne, and I've lived in Seattle for a year and a half before, and I've lived in Michigan in different places. So in that sense, it's at that very early stages of they're welcoming, they seem to be accepting, but the growth
Right.
towards inclusion, belonging, and eventually
Right.
equity is a long road.
So it's interesting because here's again how we're coming down two parallel paths, but ultimately are looking at the same thing just differently. Because I'm very interested in this idea of identity, culture versus community, and how, because like I believe, like as I said, that partly the problem with American Jews is we become too assimilated, and we just sort of have, don't keep that sort of part of ourselves that keeps us that more of that identity and culture. So, but I also believe that part of that is you actually need a physical place, which is why I think that in some ways the Burmese community has really been successful to thrive, is because they have a sense of place. And they rely on each other, and it's not like a diaspora where, because when you talk about where is the African American, when I first came to Fort Wayne, and I would say, where's the African American community? Where could I go? Because like if you came to Miami, I could take you to Little Haiti, I could take you to Little Havana, I could take you to the one old last Jewish delicacy. I could take you to places. So I kept saying, and they were like, well, there isn't really, it's all over. And I was like, and they're like, and I said, well, okay, but and I think that that's very important. In terms of that part of sense of belonging, I think it is an actual physical places that you have to have. And then from that, you can also have that idea of your culture, because then you won't lose that. And then, but also then your identity could be part of that and then separated. And so
I see your point, but I see it perhaps a little differently. I see it more into, and unfortunately, and again, I don't want to speak necessarily on the Black American experience in the United States, because I can appreciate it, but I can't identify with it as, again, a white man.
No.
But there runs the big risk of ghettoization as well. So from an immigrant perspective, it's nice to come to an area where I walk around and I can see people that hear people speak my language. There's my mosque or my synagogue or even the church from, similar to the church back home. But if it stays within, in my opinion, it will always be looked at as, well, that's Chinatown, that's whatever, and you're never part of the big community.
Okay, but if it could serve as the hub, because part of when you go somewhere, like we're talking about, and you want to have these conversations and experiences, there is tremendous value of going to Chinatown or to going to, an African American to really experience soul food and, gospel music.
There is, but then the question is, if a Chinese person moves next door to you, is there that look? And that's what I'm talking about.
That to me isn't, that's not to me with the sense of, that's the bigger sense of community. I was thinking it more of the initial,
the locale,
community of which you identify, and then there are the spokes off of that. But not saying that, but you have a gathering place, just like you have a mosque, or you go to the temple, or you go to church. It is a defined gathering place, but those are based on religion. I just think maybe if they're also ones that are based on race or whatever it is that you need to, that you want to identify with, or like, the Center for Nonviolence is a place where lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgenders, they have a place they can come together. They have support groups. They have, that's what I said.
That's more like the cultural center, cultural hub.
And that's why I'm saying there's a difference between identity, culture, and community. Now, I did not address the issue of the equity because that's across, I mean, that's a more...
That's even within, men versus women
Right.
in the
I mean,
workplace.
there's so much of that
There's
issue.
a lot
Right.
of that issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, with all immigrant communities, they concentrate in one place, and it's like you bring your uncle, you bring your cousin,
Right.
however, and it grows into that central location. And what we're seeing, speaking of the Burmese community as well, they were the highest concentration per capita in Fort Wayne. But over the past 3 or 4 years, then they start branching out into different states and different
And then
cities.
also because their children are educated in America, because at first you really had the language barrier.
And easier
that's
to
the
navigate
biggest,
the systems
right,
and all
because
that.
when you went to, so when you went from Qatar and then you were originally going to come to the States, but then you went to Canada,
Yeah.
how you learned, but you studied English because that was very important in Qatar.
It was in 5th grade
Right.
forward, you start learning English.
So you
but-
didn't have, because a lot of immigrants I'm sure that you talk to, the first thing that they will say is the biggest barrier they have, first of all, is language.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's part of the conversation, is how they learned the language, where they learned it, and so on. And it is a barrier in and of itself, but it's something, once you learn it, you learn how to navigate the culture, you get a little more comfortable, you can kind of further
Right.
out from, or branch out from the hub or the central community that brought
But
you
at the
here.
same time, you have the challenge, which is a lot of what, second and third, especially, they talk about like the tiger moms, like the Asian, where they want to have much more tighter control, but then your kids are really Americanized. I mean, as much as we were talking about that before we started, about the idea with your children of having them want
Finding the balance.
of the faith, yet they are inundated in so much that is contradictory to your basic premise of your faith. How do you balance that? Because you want them to feel, because they are American citizens, and you want them to feel home here, yet you want them to have that cultural identity and being able to...
And one of the things that I've intentionally worked on, and my wife is white from Michigan, just to
Right.
give that perspective as well. One of the things
her father was actually Dutch, right?
her
Yeah.
father is Dutch, her mom is Michigan, born
Right.
and raised in generations. But her father is from the Netherlands, still thick accent and all. But with my kids, what my experience has been with other families that I've seen, or kids my age, when I was, in my forming years in the United States, I've noticed that, and I've intentionally, I don't talk about home as a different place than the United States. So when I talk with my kids, you're fully 100% American. That doesn't mean that you're not part Dutch, part Palestinian, doesn't mean that you're not Muslim, but understanding that, because a lot of times what I noticed, again, when I was in college or whatever, is that classmates or colleagues, their parents are talking about home. And I see them growing up not knowing where home is, because they grew up here,
Right.
but mom and dad talk about home.
And that was an issue for you.
But no, in a sense, but here it kind of created that sense of loss for them, is that they couldn't mend home with here, because there was always that sense of, we're going to pick up and go home at any moment. So there wasn't that sense of, at least my perception, there wasn't that sense of stability here, that this is home. For me, for the kids, this is home. And home is also, what brought you here, and understanding the heritage that brought you here, and that makes up part of your personality and informs who you are. Because as a Muslim, again, you can live anywhere in the world. It's not exclusive to one geographical location or another. So that's more of what I focus on with them, is knowing the religion, understanding it, and knowing how to practice it, but knowing that they are American through and through, but an American Muslim.
Right.
American through and through, but with a grandfather who is from the Netherlands, grandparents who were from Palestine, and that informs their identity and gives them a sense of, I love this country because I can be all these things.
Now, does your wife, does she wear a hijab? And
No.
No, so okay. So you don't necessarily have also that sort of trying to reconcile also that they would see that she looked remarkably, different, and therefore...
I mean, the hijab is a personal spiritual
That's what I
growth as
learned,
well.
yeah,
So
yeah.
they're, the kids, what they're seeing is that she's on her own personal spiritual path, and, you don't want to try and hammer faith into anyone,
Right.
especially your kids. And
Right.
it's a really hard one for me to work with. But having the experiences that I've had and realizing that I came to learn my religion at at somewhat of an older age,
Right.
After the experiences, I wanted to make sure that you don't create too limiting of an understanding for them so that they don't lose it altogether,
Right.
nor too loose that they lose it altogether,
Right.
and try to find that balance. And so I'm hoping to equip them with the tools so that they can, practice the faith moving
And the
forward.
majority of it is that it's what you do, not what you say as their parent.
Yeah.
But also there is that time really when people go to college traditionally that they just forget anything and they're going to explore it and then they'll come back to it or they adopt
Yeah.
it or there's sort of like how you take some of the traditions and you sort of modernize them and you accommodate them to your
Culture is gonna evolve.
Right.
Religion for me, I didn't know how to use faith to quote unquote protect me from certain things or to inform certain decisions that I was making in college. And this is what I'm hoping to give them here so that once they get to that point,
So
they
it's a
have a little more.
grounding kind
It's a
of thing,
grounding.
right.
It's building the
Right.
foundation. Yeah.
So as you think that you finished the second season and now that you're going to be departing, what are some of the thoughts or ideas or things that you would want to leave the community with as we continue to go forward with this looking into understanding the immigrant and obviously maybe someone will continue I'll certainly have conversations, but not to the extent of an immigrant understanding those things.
The good news is my understanding is that we're going to continue with season 3, even because with season 2,
You've branched out.
We've
so that
experimented with Zoom,
right.
and it worked out. Actually, the recording worked
Right.
out well.
And I think it's good to bring other, immigrants from other cities because I just think like me, I've never lived. I've only lived in major metropolitan areas. I've only lived in cities that had significant Jewish communities. So as much as I think, like I'm a geographic immigrant.
Yeah.
There's lots of different ways of being an immigrant.
Yeah.
So I think that would be good to bring those conversations.
And that's what we branched out to in season 2, where one of the folks we interviewed is actually an old classmate of mine in College of Pharmacy. He's Nigerian, and his wife is white American. And the dynamic of an interracial marriage with kids who, are
Right.
also,
and
very
in this
easily
time,
identified.
and they live in the United States.
They live in
Right.
Michigan. So having that conversation, there's a Burmese couple, both, from Burma, born and raised, and came here at an older age, and their dynamic with Fort Wayne or the United States in general. So branching out in the sense of, being an immigrant impacts a lot of different people
Right.
In many different
Right.
ways, mainly positive, some negative, but the majority is those experiences that you might not necessarily see in Fort Wayne, they exist outside, and I want to bring that perspective in as well. So we've experimented with Zoom. What I'm really hoping for is that if I identify another local NPR station in the Connecticut area, that I can be in that studio.
Right.
Katie Anderson, the producer.
Right,
here
because
can do this,
because that's
and
the
we
whole
can
idea of
work together.
NPR that they can connect
We
on a
can
net with the
connect
local,
and-
right?
And
so
I
that
really
would be-
want to try and elevate it as much as possible to just outside of Indiana kind
Right.
of conversation.
Right. So that's good news.
Yeah.
But with you leaving, and sort of what would be the things or the things that you would want to hope that we would continue to do or encourage us to do or sort of say.
I'm hoping that we continue to keep an open mind and to continue to have those conversations, or actually to get back to having those conversations, because again, if we follow one thought process of X people are Y and Z, we'll miss out on so much, first of all, and then we would create this echo chamber, this
Right.
isolation
Right.
that would tear us apart.
Right.
So what I would hope that we can continue is, I'll use an example of someone on a panel I was on about diversity, and he was a gentleman in a wheelchair, and he's a almost an invisible minority. He's like,
Yes.
a lot of people don't think about walking down the street, or being in your
No,
wheelchair.
no, I
on the
noticed
street.
that with when my mother was in a wheelchair and to navigate. But then when people would ask me, they'd say, "Oh, what does she want?" Or how, the doctor, how she. I'm like, I don't know. Ask her.
her.
I mean, she's sitting right there. So it is that.
So he was saying, what you kind of alluded to earlier in the conversation is that, a lot of times he's at a convenience store, supermarket, whatever, and a 4-year-old with his mom or her dad or whatever, and say, what's this? Or, what's going on with him? Or why are you in a wheelchair? And mom or dad just say, shh, we don't talk about these things. He's like, no. We have to talk about these things, because I'd rather, and obviously he's like, not every single time and not every time I'm going to answer you and whatever, respect his humanity, respect his personal space. But answering that question from her, and he'll tell you, I was sick when I was a kid, or I was in a car accident.
Right, they'll explain it,
Explain it,
and they're not,
the kids will be like, okay,
because
all
it's
right.
not ill intent.
Exactly.
Okay, so in all fairness of wanting to ask like that one question, that having that hard conversation in relation to the Palestinian-Israel question, I want to know from your standpoint, do you think that there truly is the real possibility of peace with a two-state solution?
Two-state solution carries a big political whatever. I don't fully understand it. But with two people living under one shared government, if we see beyond and we see the humanity of each other, and if the imbalance of power is not tipped in favor as it is towards the state of Israel, and towards politicians that label Palestinians as animals or whatever, and if we move beyond that, if we can accomplish, whatever we can accomplish in that, yes, because prior to that, Palestinians, Muslim, Christians, and Jews lived in that holy land and lived together, and celebrated with each other, and we were one nation. But if a nation within its laws discriminates and excludes because of faith or because of heritage or origin or whatever, I don't see that happening.
But do you think that, like we talked about, if you're the one generation, like your parents and then you, and do you think though realistically that this would be successful? Because I don't know if the current generations or the adults now, I don't know if they could forgive. I don't know if there's that trust, and there's been so much fracture. So it's sort of like, sort of why, in a sense, why, God had the Jews walk around for 40 years was because he needed to get rid of a generation, in a sense. He needed to start anew.
And I don't think us on the outside, in the comforts of our homes, can speculate on this or that or the other. I think it has to come organically from within. What I feel that part of my identity is to bring awareness in a I'll be blunt, a very biased narrative because of a lot of not because of Judaism as much, but Jews in the United States, but because of a huge lobby called Christian Zionism as well. And that Zionism, that's what I want to distinguish and differentiate. But
I would say it's interesting because I could say the same thing. I think it's very biased.
When you look at media and the showing of the Palestinian narrative is lacking in many different ways in the mainstream media of the United States. So that part of my identity and the chip on my shoulder, I guess, is to present that perspective, is to show that perspective. The people of the land, what happened, the history, the current situation on the ground right now of a wall that divides, of a Israelis only road, of policies that discriminate. If we call Israel an ally and a friend of the United States, we need to hold it accountable. And giving $3.8 billion in military aid annually, and even though we give other money to other countries, but that amount of favoritism in our politics towards a regime is not going to solve the issue unless we come to the table and say, all need to be treated fairly, equally, and find that space. Okay,
so if you had to spin this, right, from the standpoint of, I'm going to ask you to play if you were an Israeli, okay, or, and there is a very important distinction that we need to make between being an Israeli and being Jewish,
yes.
and then the idea of being a Zionist and being an anti-Zionist has nothing to do also with being Jewish.
Exactly.
So, but in terms of as an Israeli, looking at the situation, and so if you had to spin it from their perspective, and you hear that people want to wipe the country off the face of the earth, and there's from the river to the sea kind of. So how can you understand I'm not excusing it.
No,
it's the same
I
thing,
understand.
because on this level we absolutely can say that a lot of the issues are the same systemic institutionalized things that are bred into the history of this country in the relations between African Americans and white, okay?
Yeah.
So we absolutely can parallel it that way. But can you understand where some of that comes from? Not necessarily the outcome of it, but...
And so, first, I appreciate you highlighting that, and I'll highlight it again, that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism,
Right.
and that, Judaism is not...
People try to put them together,
They try.
but they have to be separate.
Absolutely. And they try to, this is where malintent comes in. They try to ignite okay, look at a Muslim and a Jew, they're never going to talk to each
Right.
other. And they paint it in that, again,
Right.
black and white. I would actually go to Miko Peled. Miko Peled is the son of the general. He has a book called Son of a General. Israeli, born and raised, actually I'm not sure if born and raised, but from the West Coast as well. But Israeli, his father or grandfather was one of the ones who signed the Declaration of the State of Israel.
Right. Isn't he the one that's going to be part of is he forming the new...
No,
he's not. Because there's another one who was originally educated in the U.S. that's forming the new government. But
when you hear his story or read his book, the way that he paints it, because I'm talking from his perspective, is that there is so much propaganda within Israel that they're coming to get you, to create that sense of you don't talk to that person on the other side. Otherwise, the second that they see you, they're going to kill you or shoot you or whatever. So I can understand the fear that creates.
Right.
And again, we need to get past that to have those conversations. He came to that realization from a very tragic place where a suicide bomber killed his niece. And another child, Palestinian child, was killed. And he stepped back and he said, what am I part of here? And came to that understanding. And again, we're talking about systemic, governmental issues that are causing that divide and trying to protect itself by causing that divide, by saying Arabs and Jews will never see each other eye to eye. Muslims and Jews hate each other, or they've never lived together, or Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land, and all of that. So we need to clean all that out. Is there hate within Palestinian groups on the inside? Yes, and again, if we flip sides, we'll understand that because of the situation. Right. But are there more people who are willing to actually come to an actual peace? I think that's what everybody's looking for. But again, there's a huge imbalance in power in favor of one government or one state versus the other. And if we don't play the role of the ally, the good friend in that relationship, it will take us eons to get to that point.
Right.
So yes, I see road to peace. I'm always an optimist looking towards peace, and I think it starts with conversations, and I think it starts with like we talked about, understanding the humanity of each other, but also within the big picture and looking at the big pieces that we can do to remove these barriers so people can have those conversations.
But I think, truthfully, there's so much of this big and things that we can't control that it actually does start in having these conversations and just sort of understanding and sort of questioning, even, having that conversation with myself was like, because I was very interested, because I knew that being a Muslim has nothing to do with being Palestinian. So I was so very interested in how you identified the two and how they were linked to who you are, and sort of showing that, like you said, there's lots of different sides and you're multifaceted, but it's taking the time.
And to kind of answer maybe the question that you asked at the beginning, this is why I say I'm a Palestinian, because it intrigues people in different ways. Whether it's like, or just, I never heard of this before. I never understood this before. And it just gets you to good people that do their own self-introspection and looking into why would he identify himself. If I can plant that seed
Right.
in anyone that I meet and have them to dig a little deeper, just like I identify as a Muslim, because again, post September 11, and there's a lot of what's a good word? Crap that gets peddled
Well, there's
around.
a lot of also confusion, and then because then you have and then the understanding of what is Hamas, and then they claim and then because with a lot of the suicide bombers, they claim that they're doing it in the name of Allah, and so it's all these, and that's the problem
and
with
suicide is a major sin in Islam that actually keeps
Right.
you out of the fold of the religion. If
So
you
I would
commit
think that you
suicide.
also would have some of this focus and drive to sort of clarify that not being associated, not all Muslims, these are not, these are different like fringe groups or, that.
Yeah, and so having those conversations, and
Right.
again, I know how to navigate the conversations to, which part of my identity that I highlight more, because I feel that there's more value in that conversation.
Of course.
That people would, a lot of the talks that I did at churches or interfaith, the comment that I get the most is that, wow, we didn't realize there was this whole lot of similarities between Christianity and Islam,
Right.
or Judaism and
Right.
Islam. And,
Right.
when we talk about these, of course you didn't know because you haven't necessarily talked to a Muslim, or you've learned it from, and the same thing for me. I learned Christianity from a Muslim perspective. I learned Judaism from a Muslim perspective, or from, a book or a TV show or whatever. And I didn't know it until I actually got to meet and talk and interact with people who practice that faith.
Right. So we're just going to have to continue to keep having these conversations and inviting people to the table. And, and because I think it goes beyond, I'm not one who's we're going to agree to disagree, because I don't think that's not the intent. I think it's just coming to an understanding of just truly being interested and knowing that it's okay that you're different.
And it's okay to live your life the way, I mean, as long as we're not, hindering each other's or
Right.
trying to, which majority of the people, again, want to have a peaceful life, want to have a successful life, and want the best for them and their neighbors and their family.
Right.
And so
If we can all, right. I always say, if we could sort of focus on the 10 Commandments and the Golden Rule, we'd all be pretty good. So, but
Amen to that.
at the end of each And Good Company show, I like to ask the 12 questions that French novelist Marcel Proust popularized for a Victorian parlor game.
Okay.
Because, again, having questions and getting your answers really reveals more about who you are. And I think that gives it's much harder to hate someone when you know them than as so I really feel like these questions give us an even deeper sense of getting to know you.
Okay.
What is your idea of perfect happiness?
Ooh, I don't know. Can you define perfect happiness? I don't know if that, contentment with what you have.
What is your greatest fear?
Failure.
What is the trait you most deplore in yourself?
Most
Deplore.
deplore myself. I think my wife told me that, so I probably, it's that I calculate beyond calculation so that I can make sure that whatever happens is divine intervention and not my own fault.
Okay. I think that's the division of your scientific brain, like being in the science, and then faith and religion. I think you're that internal.
But when it comes to picking the right hotel, my wife.
I could see that. Which living person do you most admire?
Which living person do I most admire? Ooh, that's a good question. I need to think on that. Sorry, give me a second. Ooh. I don't know. Can I go back to that later?
Yeah, I don't know. People are passing on something, so you're not supposed to, but okay.
It's not that I don't admire people. It's but you're asking most admire, and that to me is
Okay, so who's a living person that you admire? Or is there a living person you'd like to meet?
Living person I'd like to meet. I wasn't prepared for that question. We'll come back to it.
Okay.
Sorry.
What is your greatest extravagance?
Greatest extravagance. Sheesh, I don't know. Chocolate. I like chocolate a lot.
What is your current state of mind?
Between optimism and worry, I mean, transitioning from two different
Right.
cities, and
Well, one of the top five, you're doing, there are five top stresses in life. You're doing two of them, new job and moving. So
yeah, so the price of failure on that one is high, so it's stressing me out a little bit.
on what occasion do you lie?
I try not to.
Which words or phrases do you most overuse?
A quote by Aldous Huxley: "Experience is not what happens to a man, but what a man does with what happens to him."
What talent would you most like to have?
I'd like to play a string instrument, oud in particular.
What is your most treasured possession?
Children don't qualify as possession, but they're my most treasured thing. My most treasured possession, honestly, it's something simple, but it's a map of Palestine that shows the villages before the occupation, which shows my hometown on it.
What do you most value in your friends?
Dependability.
What is your greatest regret?
I mean, some decisions that I've made that I wish I made differently.
Can you think of one that you'd want to share?
It goes back to college, but nothing in particular. Yeah.
If you were to die and come back as a person or a thing, what would it be?
Cat. Spoiled as all get out. Probably. I know from having 3 of them. They seem to have a pretty good
So
life.
you'd want to come back as one of your cats.
One of my cats.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for coming and having a conversation, and hopefully we can continue to hear these conversations and learn more from your new experiences, and that you'll still continue to help bring the I, an immigrant, back to us here in Fort Wayne.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you can learn more about And Good Company and all the other great conversations we have had at andgoodcompany.info. And we look forward to next week when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.